Listen for words of faith in the book of Amos. This is what the sovereign God showed me. God was standing by a wall, a plumb line in hand. "What do you see, Amos?" Yahweh asked me. "A plumb line," I replied. Then God said to me, "Look, I am going to measure my people Israel by plumb line. I will no longer excuse their atrocities. The high places of Isaac are going to be ruined, the sanctuaries of Israel destroyed. With sword in hand, I will attack the house of Jeroboam." For words of faith in ancient texts.
Hear words of faith from 1 John 4, 7-12. Beloved, let us love one another, because love is of God. Everyone who loves is begotten of God and has knowledge of God. Those who do not love have known nothing of God, for God is love. God's love was revealed in our midst in this way, by sending the only begotten into the world, that we might have faith through the Anointed One. Love, then, consists in this, not that we have loved God, but that God has loved us and has sent the only begotten to be an offering for our sins. Beloved, if God has loved us so, we must have the same love for one another. No one has ever seen God, yet if we love one another, God dwells in us, and God's love is brought to perfection in us. For the call to discipleship from the early church, we give thanks.
Hear words of faith from the Gospel of Luke. An expert on the law stood up to put Jesus to the test and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit everlasting life?" Jesus answered, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" The expert on the law replied, "You must love the Most High God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbour as yourself." Jesus said, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you'll live." But the expert on the law, seeking self-justification, pressed Jesus further. "And just who is my neighbour?" Jesus replied, "There was a traveller going down from Jerusalem to Jericho who fell prey to robbers. The traveller was beaten, stripped naked, and left half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. The priest saw the traveller lying beside the road, but passed by on the other side. Likewise, there was a Levite who came the same way. This too saw the afflicted traveller and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was taking the same road also came upon the traveller and, filled with compassion, approached the traveller and dressed the wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then the Samaritan took the wounded person on a donkey and went straight to an inn and there took care of the injured one. The next day, the Samaritan took out 2 silver pieces and gave them to the innkeeper with the request, "Look after this person, and if there is any further expense, I'll repay you on the way back." Which of these 3, in your opinion, was the neighbour to the traveller who fell in with the robbers? The answer came, the one who showed compassion. Jesus replied, then go and do the same. For the word that was in the beginning, for the word that invites and inspires, for the word embodied in us, we give thanks.
Hear our contemporary reading, The Noise of Politics, by Walter Brueggemann. We watch as the jets fly in with the power people and the money people, the suits, the budgets, the billions. We wonder about monetary policy because we are among the haves, and about generosity because we care about the have-nots. By slower modes, we notice Lazarus and the poor arriving from Africa, and the beggars from Central Europe, and the throng of environmentalists with their vision of butterflies and oil, of flowers and tanks, of growing things and killing fields. We wonder about peace and war, about ecology and development, about hope and entitlement. We listen beyond jeering protesters and soaring jets, and faintly we hear the mumbling of the crucified one. For words of challenge and hope, we give thanks.
As Margie has already explained, David Gill has succumbed to COVID, sadly, for him and for us, because we were looking forward to hearing from him. But as she also explained, and as David explained to me, he actually presented me with two possibilities. You could look for someone else perhaps, or I could just give you my rough notes. And without consulting anyone else, I said, please give us your rough notes. And so you are hearing David's words. And he did want me to convey his apologies for not being here. He's entitled his sermon, and he always preaches, this is a sermon, he entitles his sermon, My Neighbour, My Vote. Today we have departed from the reading set in the lectionary. Why? Because this country is about to choose its national leadership. The federal election is almost upon us. We have important decisions to make, and as Christians, we have serious thinking to do. Today's Bible readings might help. A few minutes ago, we heard from Amos. He was a prophet called to speak truth to the movers and shakers of his day. It was a time of prosperity. People were comfortable. They saw this as evidence of God's blessing. But they weren't sharing their prosperity with the poor. They were religious, but their religion did not flow on into the nation's relationships. Faith was not finding expression in social justice. The prophet has a vision involving a plumb line. The image on the front of your liturgy sheet is a very telling one, I think. A length of string with a weight tied to it, used to check whether a wall had been built straight. The wall here represents Israel, measured against the plumb line of God's will. Israel is found to be warped, out of alignment. So judgment is in prospect. Let justice roll down like waters, Amos had written a couple of chapters earlier, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. From justice in our first reading, the other readings took us to its close relation, love. The story of the Good Samaritan is one of the best-known passages in the Bible. Jesus has just made an important point. Love of God and love of neighbour is what life is all about. Then comes the question, who is my neighbour? Jesus' story is a double-barrelled response. First answer, the neighbour is the person, any person, who is in need. But then Jesus reverses the question, who behaved like a neighbour? Answer to that, the man, incidentally a Samaritan, a despised outsider, a person of another faith, who saw the other's need and did something about it. The double-edged implication is clear. Painfully clear, inescapably clear. Mark Twain once said, "It ain't those parts of the Bible that I can't understand that bother me. It's the parts I do understand." The Samaritan story is one we all understand, right? Though we sometimes wish we didn't, right? Justice and love. Two imperatives of the Christian faith. What might they imply for us as, on Saturday week, we line up for our date with democracy? I'm not going to tell you who you should vote for, that's not my job, but I'm going to ask you to think about how the Christian faith might bear upon your vote. That is my job. The key word is think. In the run-up to an election, complex issues get trivialised. As the American writer H.L. Mencken warned, to every human problem there is a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. So think. 8 points to factor into your thinking. Doesn't that sound like David? Don't ask which party's policies might advantage you or your family. Admittedly, we're not offered a lot of choice this time round, but there are some options. Australia's Catholic bishops have issued a statement entitled "Towards a Better Kind of Politics." Look beyond self-interest, their statement urges, and use your vote for the good of all. Wise advice, not only for Christians. 2, as you consider the common good, bear in mind what Amos had to say. Not just Amos, the entire prophetic stream, about the importance of social justice. Justice for the poor, the forgotten, the stranger in our midst. Our efforts for justice will always be imperfect, but the God-given goal stands ever before us. How are we to press towards that goal amid the stubborn realities of today through the process of collective decision-making called politics? It's complicated. So, 3, draw on the wisdom of the church. You're not struggling with this alone. Beware noisy groups like the right-wing Australian Christian lobby, which purports to represent the churches when it actually doesn't. Of course, the churches don't always get things right either, but they are sources of help. The Uniting Church and the Roman Catholic Church especially have competent people advising them on social justice issues. They're worth listening to and learning from. 4, don't forget the saga of the Good Samaritan. Justice matters, but there is more to following Jesus than political activism. So many encounters in the Gospels involve simple acts of mercy. As St. Paul might have written, but unfortunately didn't, I don't support all the right causes. I may support all the right causes. I might turn up for all the right demonstrations. I may vote for all the right candidates. But if I have not love, I am nothing. Love is our calling, no matter who governs in Canberra. Mercy can mitigate even the worst injustice. Think slavery and the difference kindness by a slave owner could make. And without mercy, even the best social order can be a soulless bureaucracy. Justice and love, each is different, both are vital. 5. Earth your thinking in the real world. Politics, as you know, is the art of the possible. Be realistic in what you expect from the state. Faced with armed conflict, for example, an individual may well opt for pacifism, unconditional love. But that choice is not open to a government charged with the nation's defence. Faced with one asylum seeker needing help, simple compassion is the way to go. Faced with tens of millions, as governments are now, simple compassion is not an option. Difficult judgments and painful compromises cannot be avoided. What compassion requires of me is one thing. What might be the best policy achievable for the whole nation is quite another. Political ethics involves weighing options that are open to the collective, not those that we may espouse as individuals. Lose sight of that distinction, as church people sometimes do, and we render ourselves irrelevant to national decision-making. Remember that political differences are always between flawed human beings, never between sinners on one side and saints on the other. That recognition should mitigate self-righteousness and vindictiveness, not least on the internet. It should take the sting out of how people deal with their opponents, and it ought to make us wary of extremist language of all kinds. To use whatever opportunities come our way to inject civility into Australia's political debate, use it. Keep telling yourself and anyone who will listen that if your candidate wins, it won't produce a perfect Australia. And if he or she loses, it's not the end of the world. Faith in God means, among other things, keeping politics in perspective. 7. Do not join the chorus of those who rubbish politicians. I know some make it difficult, but try to be grateful for those who offer themselves for public office. Members of Parliament have a thankless task with atrocious hours, a dreadful public image, collateral damage to families, and no job security whatsoever. Men and women who put their hands up for election deserve better than to be met with cynicism. Be thankful for them. Pray for them. And mean it. 8. Do not confuse all of this with the good news of the gospel. The good news is not that you and I are going to strive for social justice or turn ourselves into Good Samaritans. At the end of the day, all such efforts, we know, will prove inadequate. That knowledge won't stop us from trying, of course, but the defects in us and therefore in our politics and policies, our compassion and caring, will remain. The justice of God's kingdom keeps pressing upon us, but its fullness remains ever beyond us. That's the sobering news. The good news is not about us at all. but about the mysterious reality that embraces us in life and death. Remember, we're still in the season of Easter, than which there could be no better time for a federal election. For Easter reminds us of a divine mercy able to overcome the contradictions and failures that we cannot. It tells us that beyond our guilt, there is grace. Beyond our failure, hope. Beyond our sin, the ever-present possibility of a new beginning. That is what we celebrate. That whatever people know it, whether people know it or not, is the good news indeed. For the nation as a whole, for those who are going to find themselves as members of the next federal parliament, and for those of us whose votes are going to put them there. So David ends, for love so great, so deep, so true, for the mercy that overarches all our years. Thanks be to God.